and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, I'm not sure if you remember, but we did an episode recently in the outro, and like someone tweeted about this. I think your final line was, "It's pretty good to be a landlord." Like we were talking about rent, and you're like, "It seems good to be a landlord."
I stand by it.
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm getting criticized for throwing out these truth bombs. It's good to be a landlord.
No, I don't think it's even a criticism. It's like sometimes the truest things are the obvious things that no one says directly, and that someone just says like, it seems pretty good. And like rent prices, as we've been discussing, like they never seem to go down. There are all kinds of tax advantages, it seems like, to owning real estate. It's hard to build more of it. It seems pretty good.
It seems good. I guess my question is, was it always this good? And will it always be this good? Because, I mean, the reason we're talking about it is because it does feel like there is a backlash at the moment, or more of a backlash. I guess landlords are never an especially beloved social class, but with prices being what they are at the moment, with rents going up, particularly in places like New York City, it does feel like there is this question of whether or not maybe the government, the state, could do something to attenuate those higher rent prices.
I guess there's like two questions to my mind about the sort of like whether it's good to be a landlord. And one is like, okay, we do know that like probably like rent growth is going to slow. And we talked to the guy from Apartment List, Chris Salviati, several weeks ago, and he's like, okay, probably like rents are going to come down a bit, maybe, or flat, or maybe not grow. But like that's just a cycle thing, right? And then there's the question of like, is there something deeper that's not just about like the macroeconomic cycle, but is something going to like change about the business? And you know, like, one thing that I sort of still kind of believe in markets is that like if there's like alpha somewhere, if there's above market returns, it can't stay forever. Eventually, like it's got to get arbed away, right?
I think maybe I'm a little bit more cynical than you. I think people will try to hang on to their price advantage as long as they possibly can.
Yeah, no, I mean I agree. It's just like they can't be like some business that's just like permanently better than all the other businesses, right? Like it's not how markets or capitalism are supposed to work. Like capital is supposed to flood in, or supply is supposed to come on, and eventually the returns from asset A on a risk-adjusted basis should equal the returns from asset B, also, you know, on a vol-adjusted basis or something like that.
Well, I guess this is where we start talking about real-world constraints and policy constraints again. But yes, in theory, it should change.
Right. And so we have been, you know, talking about, you know, real estate quite a lot. And I do think that in this sort of like pandemic / post-pandemic environment, lots of anxiety about real estate. Not just like high costs are a huge aspect of it. Availability, the types of real estate that people want. And so it's like a good question to like, how good has the landlord market been? And if we're at a period where a lot of things are changing, rates are reversing.
I was about to say, I think interest rates are going to be the big factor here.
Leverage, huge aspect of the real estate business reversing. Can the golden age of being a landlord persist if many other macro things and political things are changing?
Is it still good to be a landlord?
Is it still good to be a landlord? All right, well, I'm very excited about our guest. We're going to be speaking with Ben Carlos Thypin. He is a real estate investor and broker in New York City, and he has a lot of views on this question and why maybe the golden age is coming to an end, or will. So, Ben, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we can even ask the question, is the golden age of being a landlord coming to an end, we have to first establish, was there really a golden age? And I guess the question, the way I think about that, is it true that real estate owners, landlords, people who rented out their units, enjoyed a period of unusually high and stable returns?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, I think it's important to make a distinction between different types of real estate owners. So there's, residential rental landlords and commercial landlords and even homeowners. I'm going to talk today mostly about residential landlords and homeowners.
And you are a residential landlord.
I am a residential landlord in addition to being a commercial landlord, and I'm also a broker that deals with a lot of other residential landlords and investors on a daily basis.
So what is this goal? Tell us, establish for us that there in fact has been a golden age.
So I think in order to understand there's a golden age, you have to understand the history that preceded it.
Okay.
So there's this great paper by this professor, Katarina Knoll from the University of Bonn, that looks at the housing prices over time from 1870 to present. And she studies 14 countries, including the United States. And what she found is that up until around 1950, depends on the country, in the United States it was probably the late 60s, housing prices were relatively flat. And then after that, they've exploded. And that's housing data, rent and otherwise, is notoriously difficult to capture because it's such a disparate distributed market, but that backs up with qualitative observations as well. So there's this great book that I recommend everyone read about the history of these New York City real estate families called Skyscraper Dreams. And there's a recurring theme in this book of sort of the residential, the families that specialize in apartment buildings complaining about not getting as rich as quickly as the office developers or the office landlords because, partly because of rent control, but it was just a sleepier business. So what changed in the mid-20th century? A couple different things. We're all familiar, I imagine, with the story of the subsidization of homeowners and single-family homes in the suburbs. And simultaneously, as that was occurring in terms of the public's investment in the apartment business and rental housing, it shifted from public housing to private sector solutions, whether it's Freddie Mac subsidizing multifamily developers or even nonprofit developers. Simultaneously with that, land use controls were implemented to protect the investments of homeowners. That's sort of the most generous way to describe it. It also did things like enforce de facto segregation and school segregation and all sorts of other less noble things. So in the late 70s, after all this had happened for a decade or two, what you had is this coalition formed of homeowners and conservative interests, both business and otherwise, teaming up to pare back rent regulations where they existed, ban them where they didn't exist, and generally implement a set of policies that discriminated against renters either directly via things like a property tax policy or indirectly because most renters at that time were of some sort of marginalized status socioeconomically. So they also pared back the state's ability to regulate landlords, both in practice, but I'd say more crucially in terms of state capacity to actually effectively punish landlords for misbehavior. So for instance, in the original rent stabilization program in New York City, there was a way for the buildings, if they were violating certain standards, to be their rents to be pared back, and the state could take control of these buildings in a more assertive way. That was then removed. So let's before I get to the more specific consequences, let's talk about what that actually created from a market structure perspective. Homeowners become this very powerful political bloc. Their relative permanence increases their propensity to vote, and they team up with conservative interests to weaken the state. The idea that everyone becomes a homeowner becomes gospel, and homes become used as investments. But this was always sort of a Ponzi scheme because you're protecting the investments by putting up barriers to entry. So one generation buys in, gets rich off of it, and then housing prices get too expensive so that the next generation can't buy in, or if they do, they're buying in on much more vulnerable terms. Because,
burdensome.
Yeah, they're higher loan to values. The values themselves are arguably inflated. So all this leaves the rental market as a market with essentially unlimited demand, a growing pool of participants on the demand side, and unlike other utility markets, which is basically what housing is, it's vastly and wildly unregulated. So it would be like Enron in the early 2000s and late 90s that was just going wild on deregulated energy markets, except we've been doing it all over the country for decades.
Can I just ask a really basic question? But if you're a landlord, how are you making most of your money? Is it by getting the monthly rent, or is it by building up a real estate portfolio and then selling it or flipping it at some point in time? Like, what is the mix? And I know you made the point about the difference between mom and pop landlords versus the big corporations. Can you just talk a little bit more about the different business models?
Sure. So partly that depends on the business model of the landlord, but also depends on the market. So New York City is much more of a appreciation-based market than a yield market. Whereas someplace in the Sun Belt might be more yield focused than appreciation focused. So in New York City, you typically make your money selling or refinancing or by generating scale. Scale obviously helps in every market. Whereas in other less core markets, the more of the return is in the yield. And this is a good segue into sort of the other dynamic that produced this situation is that we have this vast unregulated rental market, and simultaneously we have an institutionalization of the business of multifamily. And this is kind of this is a broader economic trend that happened with corporations in the latter half of the 20th century, and even with other sectors of real estate. So like 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the self-storage business was a very mom and pop business, but now it's this hugely institutionalized business. So this has happened in a particular acute way in multifamily because of just how big of a market it is, how long-standing of a business it is, and how relatively homogeneous the product is.
Well, I was going to say, too, I know, like, if there is this inherent challenge of creating new units, and we talk about, like, the sort of barriers to entry, I have to imagine that scale becomes a very big advantage in knowing how to navigate these permitting, like, how do you do construction in New York City? The entities that have done it over and over and over again have to have a pretty significant advantage over a smaller, less institutionalized. I get there's a difference between developer and landlord, but it just feels like with all of these things, there must be quite a few advantages to scale on this type of stuff.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between landlords and developers, but I think to your broader point is correct, which is, and this has been particularly enabled by technology. This used to be a very inefficient business, and the institutionalization has sucked all of the inefficiency out of this business through technology that has been implemented to price rents more efficiently, the disaggregation of functions. So historically, the apartment owners were everyone was sort of in the same company. And now all these different roles have been distributed into other companies. They're specialists that provide third-party services. It's become a business where everyone is getting their cut, and scale puts you in the best position to reap the benefits of economies of scale.
So your argument is that, a process beginning, I guess, in the 1950s of deregulation combined with institutionalization of the rental market starts to change the profit dynamics for landlords. Can you talk a little bit more about exactly how that happens and how it sort of develops up until, I guess, today?
It's really demographic driven. It was designed to serve this growing class of homeowners. A growing class of college graduates enters the real estate business. Historically, it was a business that a lot of people without that much education could get into, and they start applying modern business processes to pricing units more efficiently, to operating the buildings more efficiently, just picking at every possible part of the business to extract profit out of it. That has served the industry very well, but it has not served, arguably, the greater public very well. And I think that's sort of where these dynamics these twin dynamics of demographic change prompting policy and technology prompting institutionalization are now going to flip back the other way, and we're starting to see the beginnings of that.
So I want to obviously talk about this flip and some of the demographics and all that. But before I do, can you just expand? You made one point about disparate property tax treatment that you said put renters at a disadvantage. Can you clarify what is in the code that is so advantageous to landlords?
Sure. So as a general matter, around the United States, homeowners are viewed as the most important political bloc in any jurisdiction, and their property taxes are kept low, and particularly the increases in their property taxes. So municipalities really have very few levers for generating revenue in this country. So they need some place to make up the revenue. So as a result, apartment buildings start taking on a larger and larger share of the burden. This works different ways in different jurisdictions, but in New York City, for instance, buildings over 11 units make up an increasing share of the revenue for taxes. This also applies to commercial properties, whereas buildings of 1 to 3 units have artificial or caps on the amount that their assessment can grow every year. And even buildings of 4 to 10 units also have caps, although albeit is not as good as the 1 to 3 families, which is sort of a reflection of the same political dynamic in that the people that at least policymakers believed own these small apartment buildings are closer to a voter. It's sort of your yeoman, your landlord, not the big bad landlord. So these groups have been given preferential property tax treatment, and the apartment buildings and in turn their residents have been getting increasingly unfavorable property tax treatment.
So the landlord business, what exactly are the risks that landlords are taking on, and how should they be compensated for that? Because when I think of a landlord, it's like, okay, maybe you have a bad tenant who doesn't pay their rent on time. That's a little bit of a risk. But in general, it feels like there are a lot of protections around the business. And it also feels like there's a tendency for real estate prices to mostly go up, especially in New York.
Right. So dealing with, problematic tenants, and also, operational increases. So let's talk about the tenant side. The tenant side, that varies widely from landlord to landlord. So, our tenants, generally speaking, are pretty wealthy. I have never had to evict someone. And, we rarely have issues. Whereas there's lots of landlords that have tenants that have a more marginalized socioeconomic status, and that's trickier. However, the demand for that is very high, and the yields that those properties trade for are generally higher. So their landlords are compensated for that risk. And furthermore, with the institution and the growth of Section 8 rental subsidies, a lot of these the rents being paid by marginalized tenants are effectively underwritten by the government. So, how much risk is a landlord really taking on a Section 8 building from a tenancy perspective? From the perspective of operating expenses, as we talked about, property taxes, are being constrained in some cases, but in other cases they are not. And that's, where operational efficiency comes in. So, operational costs are the most important cost for landlords to control, and in some ways they're in their least amount of control. So at least with financing costs, you have some decision over when you incur that cost. But for fuel, maintenance, like you really don't. I mean, maintenance to a lesser degree, but fuel and other more recurring costs, you don't have as much control.
I want to ask about financing, because of course, we sort of talked about in the intro, lots of things are shifting. And one thing that seems to be shifting is like maybe this 40-year steady decline in interest rates. Can you talk a little bit about, from your experience, like your mix of like equity, borrowing, et cetera, and if there is, this like sustained reversal, what does that do to your economics?
Well, it doesn't do that much, or it won't do that much to my economics, because I'm gonna get out of this business. But
you're gonna stop being a landlord altogether?
I'm gonna stop being.
It's that bad?
I'm gonna stop being. It's not so much it's bad. We can get into the reasons why further, but like, I think going forward, certain types of players in this business are gonna make money, are gonna make sort of above average returns, and the rest will make, utility or bond-like returns. And if I'm going to buy a bond, I'd rather buy tips. And if I'm going to, I'd rather invest in real estate that is less management intensive than residential.
Well, okay, just before we get, because this is the heart of the question, why you want to get out. But before we get to that, were you staying in? Can you talk a little bit about it?
So on financing, I think, as you pointed out, we've been, coming out of this 40-year period where interest rates have been very low, and a lot of business models have been built on very cheap capital, and as a result, yields have become very low in certain markets, really most markets, and I think that's a particular challenge in markets that were depending on one of two things: regulatory arbitrage and appreciation. So we talked about the difference between markets in which the main component of the return is yield versus versus appreciation. The yield markets, they're going to not be as challenged from a sort of being able to sell for the right price perspective. Certainly some people will, but a market like New York City, that's a little more challenging, because if you buy at a 5% return and you finance that at a 3.5% return, and you're assuming that you're going to be able to sell that at a 4.5%, or you were when you bought it 4 years ago, that's not a realistic assumption anymore. So, depending on your leverage level, you have a different set of options to either continue on or extricate yourself from that situation.
So, I'm sorry, can you talk a little bit more about what you see changing now, other than the higher interest rates? Like, what is the mix that is going to pressure the rental business?
Sure. So, we have the demographic-driven policy decisions that were made in the mid to late 20th century are now coming home to roost. You have this growing class of renters. You have increasing rent burdens. Evictions are destroying lives, just like foreclosures are. And I think most crucially, this crisis is now including people from that very powerful political bloc, insofar as, people of my generation, and our generation really, who would have been homeowners 30 years ago, are now not going to be homeowners. Or if they are, they're going to pay much more for it and become homeowners much later in life, and view it more as a housing cost stability vehicle. There's this joke about the 30-year mortgage being homeowner rent control. And I think that sort of logic is now seeping into the homeownership market, and it's becoming less of slowly becoming a less of a gambling market. So you now have this big demographic of people that are concerned with rental costs.
So this seems really key, which is that politicians have this idea of like what a good voter is, what a good citizen is like. And for years, that person was a homeowner.
Right.
And now the basic idea is that there is becoming a meaningful voting, politically influential bloc that is much more likely today to be a tenant than a homeowner than they were 30 years ago. And so the political winds are over time, there's like, the voters, this ideal voter is not necessarily a homeowner.
Right. And it's also, that sort of new renter block is teaming up with the old renter block, because it's not like we didn't have renters and they weren't organized before. Right. It's just that politicians could sort of ignore them because they're of a marginalized background, or because they are perceived to not vote as much, or whatever reasons they come up with. So this is manifesting itself in 2.5 different ways. One is the UMB movement, which for those who are not familiar is the Yes on My Backyard movement, which advocates for building more housing, particularly in high demand areas. Arguably, it's a successor movement to the fair housing movement from the late 20th century. I was one of the founders of the biggest group that does this in New York City, called Open New York. And in parallel, we have a resurgence of the rent regulation movement and sort of broad tenant protection movement more broadly. And I think it's important to keep in mind that America is pretty unique in being a developed country and having a vastly unregulated rental market. We have an unusually low home ownership rate, contrary to what people think. But unlike countries with similarly low home ownership rates, we typically don't have rent control. So Germany has comparably low homeownership rates, they have rent controls. France has comparably low homeownership rates. Paris just reinstituted them. So, we've seen this resurgence of, rent regulation, and even in not just in places like New York and California, but in Minnesota, even in Orlando, they had something on the ballot this last year. And I think this is a good segue for both of these into how the consequences of institutionalization, because institutionalization has created real estate entities that are much better targets of organizing from a political perspective. They might not be, Blackstone might not be as vulnerable as your mom and pop landlord for organizing an individual building, but in terms of like getting policy passed and creating a political coalition, it's much more compelling.
This is interesting, you hear like labor people talk about like, actually it's kind of good that Amazon is becoming a huge employer, because if you can get unions into Amazon warehouses, you've radically like changed the American labor market.
Or at least you have one identifiable entity to target, right?
And so then if you have these big institutional landlords, then like you have I hadn't thought about that. You have a thing to organize against.
It's also already sort of happening because you hear so much nowadays about institutional investors buying up single family houses for rent or for flipping purposes.
Right. And it's not like single family landlords didn't exist before, but now we're talking about it because it's Wall Street.
Yeah.
The third, I'll get into the third one in a moment, but this is also a function of technology, because the similar technologies that made it easier for institutions to be created and organize themselves are now making it easier to organize among tenants. And historically, if a bunch of people in different buildings all over the city were living under the same landlord, like how are they going to find each other? But now, there's all this public data. There's the internet. There's all different ways for people to get together and build coalitions that didn't exist before.
Can I ask you? You mentioned the UMB movement. We talked about some of this on a recent episode, and you're a part of an organization. I see all the tweets and stuff. Can you talk specifically about like how it's moving the dial, like beyond the tweets, so that it actually is affecting the economics of the business?
Sure. I'll first talk about how it's affecting the politics. Like in California, they've passed a bunch of huge laws. They've banned single-family zoning. They've upzoned, commercial corridors all over the state. In New York State, the governor recently came out with proposals to build 800,000 new homes over the next decade, which is over double the amount that was built the last decade. And in terms of the economics of the business, I think what it's mainly changed so far is where developers are willing to take chances on trying to rezone. It hasn't so much changed the economics of the sort of your as of right typical day-to-day development, because there hasn't, the UMB was very young and there hasn't been that much built yet. But now a developer might be more likely to take a chance on a rezoning in a rich neighborhood, which actually is going to be much more profitable for them, but would have than doing a poor neighborhood, but was seen as very politically challenging because like Open New York got Soho and NoHo rezoned for housing, which people thought never would happen. So it's mainly changing the sort of political environment for participants in the real estate industry that are involved in development, and the actual economics of being a landlord haven't changed in a direct way. It's been more disparate, like you saw in the Journal recently came up with this big story that everyone was reading about how rents have fallen over the country because so much supply is coming online. The UMB movement can take some credit for that, but it's also just these developers are responding to market signals that there's not enough supply.
It feels to me like there's still a lot of institutional capital flowing into this business. I mean, certainly we've talked about the big players who are snapping up single family homes, and that's been a major talking point for a couple of years now. But why does the industry presumably still see the rental market as a profitable one? Like, there still seems to be a lot of interest and money flowing into the space, and presumably it's coming in at, the type of yields and values that we've seen in previous decades.
I think the industry sees the multifamily market as a profitable opportunity for all the reasons we've been talking about. The demand is insatiable. There are controls on how much supply can be added, and it's a very capital-intensive business. So it's a good way to deploy capital. I'm not suggesting that there's going to be some sort of crash. In fact, I think institutionalization will continue apace because institutions have a lower cost of capital than your mom and pops, and they have the economies of scale and ability to execute so that they can make money in this environment, in this sort of new environment that I'm positing. And they are one of groups, and I think just representative of the big group more broadly that's going to make money in this environment, which is that people that can actually add value. So institutions are adding value from scale, operational efficiency. Developers are adding value from actually producing housing. The people that I think are going to be the losers in this scenario, or relative losers, are landlords, of which there are many, that have really just been riding rents and not really adding much. Yeah, the purest rentiers in the market.
Can you talk about the other prong when you say the return of sort of like tenants' rights? Whether is it rent control? Is it eviction restrictions? Like, what does that look like in the year 2023?
Can I tack on to that, which is, you mentioned the tax code, and of course there are a lot of tax benefits that are meant to incentivize home ownership. And this might be a weird question, but I've often wondered, why don't renters get some tax breaks? It's not really optional to pay your rent. Anyway.
No, I completely agree, Tracy. And the biggest expenditure of the federal government on housing is the homeowners interest deduction, or a mortgage interest deduction. And there's various ways that could be replicated, because I doubt it's going to be pared back. For renters, it could be universal Section 8. It could be some sort of renter's tax credit. I don't know, but I think as this demographic shift portends political coalitions and change, that's certainly on the menu of things. Just like Joe mentioned, what happens in what order is going to vary widely based on the state. So in New York State, the big push right now is for good cause eviction, which is sort of a very light touch rent regulation. That passed in California in 2018. It passed in Oregon. They have it in DC, a couple other places. They've had it in New Jersey since the 1970s. So I think that sort of thing.
Sorry, what is good cause eviction?
Good cause eviction is basically defense in an eviction case that if a landlord, if a tenant defaults on the lease, and the landlord has raised their rent by, this is defined differently in different places, an unconscionable amount.
Okay.
The tenant can use that as a defense for not being evicted. And this is, particularly valuable theoretically in instances in which let's say the conditions in the building are really bad, a tenant complains, and then the landlord says, I'm just not going to renew your lease, or I'm going to give you a huge rent increase so that you don't renew your lease. That is a de facto eviction. Right. So that sort of soft rent regulation, I think, is going to become more prevalent. The Supreme Court could certainly change some of this, but I think in the main, there's different ways that many different ways that tenants' rights can be increased, whether it's some form of rent control to right to counsel, to universal Section 8 or vouchers. And the point is that there's a growing political coalition to agitate for these measures, whatever they may be in a given political environment.
So if you're no longer a landlord, well, first of all, how serious are you about that statement? And then secondly, what do you do instead?
So I am still a landlord. This is not going to be a fire sale. And I will always be a landlord because we're still commercial landlords. But it's going to be an orderly liquidation because I don't. This is really a secular shift. This is not going to happen overnight, and plenty of people disagree with me. So they're welcome to buy my properties. I think
we inadvertently, like, this episode is just call Ben. He has properties for sale.
But I think from a brokerage perspective, I'll continue to work with players that I think are either want to get out as a result of this dynamic, or institutions that I think will benefit, or developers. But what I'm most interested in and working on a lot right now is trying to figure out ways to bet on this dynamic and short. Essentially, shorting the real estate business generally, and apartments in particular, is historically been very challenging because maybe you can short a REIT stock, but like it's not that liquid of a market, and we're working on what we think are very creative ways to bet on this dynamic.
Well, let me ask you. You said, okay, you're not really necessarily expecting a crash, but on the other hand, like, and we talked about this in an episode several weeks ago with Connor Sen, this idea that, like, everyone just assumed it's always a winner for some of the reasons you described, is just like this secular shift, people moving to the cities. It's always one. Even the great financial crisis didn't hit rent. Like, if you think about, like, well, what is the short case? How much of it is it that groupthink, essentially, within the sort of rentier class or the landlord class, just like refusing to see the writing on the wall? And is there just sort of, I don't mean a bubble in the price sense, but a bubble in this sort of like thinking through that something could actually change in a way that we haven't seen in decades?
Well, I never want to underestimate the ability of flows to impact a market.
You're speaking Tracy's language.
That said, I think it's a question of whether who this is a winner for. And I don't mean, tenants versus landlords. I mean within sort of the investment market. So, like, if you're in the capital allocation business and you want to be a bond investor or a fixed income investor, I think multifamily is going to continue to be a great business. But if you want to earn these sort of bonanza returns that you've been earning for the past several decades without doing much work, then other sectors of real estate might be a better option for you, or other sectors entirely.
I just have one question, and it sort of connects this conversation with the one we had with Chris Salviati about rents actually moving. What advice do you have for people who are trying to negotiate their rent with their landlord down, obviously, not up?
Every situation is specific, so I'll do my best to generalize, but I think you have more leverage than you think. Generally speaking, if only because a landlord, if you leave, a landlord probably loses a month of rent. So at the very least, you should factor that month of loss in rent, and maybe even a broker fee, into what you're negotiating for.
All right, Ben Carlos Thypin, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots, and good luck in your new endeavors. And I hope you timed the market well with this episode.
Thanks for having me.
Tracy, I thought that was really fascinating. And, just this idea, it's like, yes, there's obviously certain like market changes, supply and demand, interest rates and all that. But also this idea of like political changes seemed really important here.
Yeah.
And maybe not something that investors are really thinking about that much.
Well, a couple of things there. So one, I think it's always like, it's always a bit difficult to call a secular shift in something. But if you're going to do it, the sort of post-pandemic environment, when there does seem to be a lot of momentum behind, the labor class versus the capitalists, that seems to be the time to do it.
Well, and also it's like, you and I rent in New York City, and we probably know a lot of people, friends who are like professionals and have good salaries, et cetera, and who rent and who feel that like buying is very risky or unattainable, or like they haven't saved up for a down payment or for whatever reason. And it's like this idea that it's like, well, like this is like a very, there's the traditional, like sort of like more marginalized renter class, more professionalized. And so like this coming together seems like a very like potentially like powerful macro secular trend.
Yeah, but the key thing I think is always going to be the policy and whether or not you do start to see those sort of institutional protections for renters like you do in some other countries. And I know, I think we've spoken about Germany.
We're going to have
Austria
to do a Germany
before.
episode, aren't we?
Oh, Austria. Why the Austrian rental market is so different to the US. Let's do that.
And also that point about like there is a big institutional face of landlords, I thought was like super fascinating. And so the way that like Amazon becomes a good, or Starbucks becomes a target of labor organizing, you start to have this similar dynamics with tenant organizing.
Never underestimate the power of a scapegoat.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me on Twitter at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me on Twitter at The Stalwart. Follow our guest, Ben Carlos Thypin. He's at SoBendito. Slide into his DMs. Make an offer on one of his buildings. But if you're listening to him making the bear case, I don't really know why you'd want to. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin and Dash Bennett at Dashbot. And check out all of our podcasts under the handle at podcasts. And for more Odd Lots content, go to bloomberg.com/oddlots, where we post transcripts, Tracy and I blog, and we have a weekly newsletter that comes out every Friday. Thanks for listening.